The golden retriever's desperate whimpers sliced through the humid evening air of Atlanta's upscale suburbs. A sound so raw and anguished it stopped Aaliyah Jackson dead in her tracks on the cracked sidewalk of Peachtree Estates. The 25-year-old had just finished a grueling shift at the animal rescue shelter, her sneakers dusted with fur, her dark braids pulled into a messy bun, her brown eyes heavy with exhaustion after a day of cleaning kennels, feeding strays, and comforting a litter of abandoned kittens. But the cry, a piercing, guttural plea, snapped her to attention, her heart lurching as she pinpointed its source. A sprawling mansion just beyond the street, its iron gates towering like sentinels, its manicured lawn glowing under floodlights that cast long, eerie shadows. Through the sharp bars of the fence, Aaliyah saw him, a dog, his golden fur matted with blood, his front leg twisted at a grotesque angle, his head wedged so tightly between the bars that his breaths came in shallow, panicked gasps, his tongue lolling, his eyes wide with terror. He was dying, and Aaliyah knew she had seconds to act, her pulse racing as the weight of the moment crashed over her. She dropped her backpack, the worn canvas thudding onto the sidewalk, her instincts as a rescuer kicking in like a switch, her exhaustion forgotten. The fence was high, topped with spikes that glinted menacingly in the floodlights, and a sign screamed private property. No trespassing in bold red letters, a warning that echoed in her mind. But Aaliyah didn't hesitate. Couldn't hesitate. Not when a life hung in the balance. She'd spent her life saving animals, pulling them from the jaws of death in alleys, abandoned lots, and storm drains across Atlanta's roughest neighborhoods, her hands scarred from years of coaxing terrified creatures to safety. This dog, his whimpers growing weaker, his body trembling with the effort to survive, needed her now, and she'd be damned if she let a fence stop her. She gripped the bars, the cold iron biting into her palms, her sneakers finding purchase on the metal, and hauled herself up, her arms trembling as she swung over the top, narrowly avoiding the spikes that grazed her jeans, tearing a small hole in the fabric. Her landing was clumsy, her ankle twisting on the lush grass with a sharp jolt of pain that shot up her leg, but she ignored it, scrambling toward the dog, her voice soft to keep him calm despite the urgency clawing at her chest. "Hold on, buddy. I've got you," she whispered, her breath hitching as she dropped to her knees beside him. Inside the mansion, Margaret Whitmore, 60, sat in her velvet-upholstered armchair, sipping chamomile tea from a delicate porcelain cup, her silver hair pinned in a tight bun, her pale blue eyes scanning a gardening magazine she'd barely registered. The widow lived alone in this fortress of wealth, her only companion the golden retriever named Max, who'd been her solace since her husband's death 5 years ago, a quiet presence that filled the echoing halls of her empty home. But when the security alarm blared, a shrill beep cutting through her quiet evening like a knife, Margaret's heart seized with panic, the cup slipping from her hands to shatter on the hardwood floor, tea splattering across her silk robe. She rushed to the monitor on the wall, her trembling fingers fumbling with the controls, her breath coming in sharp gasps as she adjusted the screen. What she saw made her blood run cold. A black woman, her face obscured by the grainy feed, scaling her fence like a thief in the night, her movements quick and deliberate. Margaret's mind raced with fear, her years of isolation in this gated community fueling her worst assumptions, her heart pounding with the terror of intrusion. "She's after Max," she gasped, clutching her pearls, her voice a whisper of dread. "She's going to steal him, or worse." Without a second thought, she dialed 911, her voice shaking as she spoke, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "There's a thief on my property. She's trying to take my dog. She's dangerous. Please hurry. She doesn't belong here. She's a black woman, and she's up to no good." Aaliyah knelt beside Max, her hands gentle but urgent as she assessed his injuries, her breath hitching at the sight of his mangled leg, the blood seeping into the grass in a dark, spreading pool. The dog's front limb was caught in a jagged gap between the bars, the metal slicing into his flesh, leaving deep gashes that oozed with every faint movement. His head was stuck so tightly between the bars that she feared he'd suffocate if she didn't act fast. His eyes wide with terror, his tongue lolling as he struggled for air, his golden fur matted with sweat and blood. "It's okay, Max," she whispered, reading his name off his collar, her voice trembling with a mix of urgency and tenderness, her hands shaking as she brushed his fur, trying to soothe him. She pulled a small pocket knife from her jeans pocket, its blade worn from years of use, and tried to pry the bars apart, her muscles straining against the unyielding iron, her palms slick with sweat and blood, hers and Max's. The metal wouldn't budge, its edges sharp enough to draw a thin line of red across her own palm, the sting barely registering as she fought to free him. Max's whimpers turned to faint, ragged breaths, his body trembling with the effort to stay alive, his eyes glazing over as his strength faded. Aaliyah's heart pounded, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool evening air, her pulse a frantic drumbeat in her ears. She was running out of time, and she knew it. She didn't hear the sirens at first, didn't see the flashing lights until they were nearly upon her, their blue and red glow casting an eerie shimmer across the lawn, turning the grass into a patchwork of shadows. The screech of tires jolted her, a sharp, grating sound that sent a spike of adrenaline through her veins, and she turned just as a police cruiser skidded to a stop outside the gate, its headlights blinding her for a moment. Officer Daniel Harper, 40, stepped out, his broad frame filling the doorway of the car, his blue uniform stark against the fading daylight, his peaked cap casting a shadow over his pale, weathered face. His eyes narrowed as they locked on Aaliyah, young, black, kneeling in the grass of a mansion she clearly didn't belong in, her hands stained with blood, her presence a violation of the unspoken rules of Peachtree Estates. Harper had been transferred to this beat a month ago, fresh from a precinct in a rougher part of Atlanta where he'd built a reputation for being tough on crime. In his mind, this gated community was a place for white wealth, a sanctuary for people like Margaret Whitmore, not people like her, a phrase that echoed in his thoughts without him ever questioning its origin. He drew his gun without hesitation, his voice booming through the evening air, a command that brooked no argument. "Hands up, step away from the dog. Now." Aaliyah froze, her blood-smeared hands trembling as she raised them, her pocket knife falling to the grass with a dull thud, its blade glinting in the floodlights. Her heart slammed against her ribcage, a frantic rhythm that drowned out everything but the sound of Max's fading breaths. "I'm trying to save him," she shouted, her voice cracking with desperation, her eyes darting between Harper and Max, her body tense with the need to act. "He's trapped. He'll die if I don't help him. Please, just look, he's dying." Harper didn't flinch, his gun steady, his jaw tight, his pale hands gripping the weapon with a confidence born of years of unchallenged authority. "I said, step away," he barked, his tone leaving no room for negotiation, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "You're on private property, and I've got a report of a theft in progress. Move, or I'll make you." Aaliyah's chest tightened, a cold dread washing over her like a wave, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She couldn't leave Max. His breathing was shallower now, his eyes glazing over, his body slumping against the fence, the life draining out of him with every passing second. She knew he had minutes at best, maybe less, and the thought of abandoning him tore at her, a visceral pain that made her stomach churn. "Please, officer," she pleaded, her voice raw, tears pricking her eyes as she kept her hands raised, her body trembling with the effort to stay still. "He's dying. Let me help him. Just let me get him free. I'm not stealing anything, I swear. I work at an animal shelter. I know what I'm doing." Margaret burst out of the mansion, her silk robe fluttering in the evening breeze, her face pale with panic, her silver hair escaping its bun in wild wisps, her pearls bouncing against her chest. "That's her," she shrieked, pointing at Aaliyah with a trembling finger, her voice shrill with fear, her pale blue eyes wide with terror. "She's trying to steal Max. I saw her climb the fence. She doesn't belong here. She's dangerous. Do something, officer. Get her away from my dog." Harper holstered his gun but moved fast, his boots pounding the grass as he grabbed Aaliyah's arm, yanking her to her feet with a force that made her stumble. Her sneakers skidding on the slick lawn, her twisted ankles screaming in protest. "You're under arrest," he growled, his voice low and menacing, his pale hands twisting her arms behind her back with a roughness that made her gasp, her shoulders wrenching painfully. The cold metal of handcuffs snapped around her wrists, the steel biting into her skin, sending a sharp, burning pain up her arms that made her eyes water. Aaliyah cried out, her body jerking against the restraint, but her eyes stayed on Max, his whimpers now barely audible, his golden fur matted with blood, his body so still she feared the worst. "You're making a mistake," she yelled, her voice breaking, tears streaming down her face as Harper shoved her against the fence, the iron bars digging into her back, the metal cold and unyielding. "He's going to die. Please, just look at him. He needs help." Harper ignored her, his face a mask of cold authority, his grip bruising as he dragged her toward the gate, her feet dragging on the grass, her sneakers leaving faint trails in the dew. Margaret hovered nearby, wringing her hands, her voice rising in a frantic pitch, her panic fueling her words. "She's lying. She wanted to take him. I know her type. People like her don't belong here. They're always up to no good. Get her out of here," she shrieked, her eyes darting between Aaliyah and Max, her hands clutching her robe as if it could shield her from the chaos unfolding in her pristine yard. Aaliyah's chest burned with rage and helplessness, the cuffs digging deeper into her wrists, the pain a constant reminder of her powerlessness as Harper pushed her into the back of the cruiser, her body slamming against the hard seat with a force that knocked the breath from her lungs. Through the smudged window, she saw Max's limp form, his eyes half closed, his breath so faint they were barely visible, his golden fur a stark contrast to the dark blood pooling beneath him. Tears streamed down her face, hot and relentless, not for herself, but for the dog she couldn't save. The life she'd fought so hard to protect, slipping away because of a misunderstanding she couldn't undo. The door slammed shut, the sound a final, hollow echo, and the last thing she heard was Margaret's voice, fading as the car pulled away, her words a dagger in Aaliyah's heart. "Good riddance." Inside the precinct, Aaliyah sat in a holding cell, her wrists raw from the cuffs, her dark eyes fixed on the concrete floor, her sneakers scuffing the ground as she shifted, trying to ease the ache in her shoulders. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their harsh glow making her head throb, the air thick with the stale scent of sweat, disinfectant, and despair. She'd been booked for trespassing and attempted theft, charges that felt like a slap in the face after risking everything to save Max, a betrayal that cut deeper than the cuffs on her wrists. Her mind raced, replaying the scene, Max's whimpers, Harper's sneer, Margaret's accusations, the cold steel snapping around her wrists. She knew why this had happened, the bitter truth, a weight she'd carried her whole life. It wasn't just about the dog. It was about her skin, her presence in a place where people like her were seen as threats, not saviors, where a black woman's act of kindness could be twisted into a crime in the blink of an eye. Aaliyah had faced this kind of bias her whole life, a constant undercurrent that shaped her world in ways she could never escape. Growing up in a rough Atlanta neighborhood, she'd been followed in stores, her every move watched by suspicious clerks who assumed she'd steal. Stopped by cops for looking suspicious while walking home from school, her backpack searched for no reason other than her skin, turned down for jobs despite her qualifications, her resume tossed aside because her name, Jackson, sounded too black to the hiring managers who never called her back. She'd learned to navigate it, to keep her head down and her voice steady, to prove her worth in a world that refused to see it. But this was different. This time, a life had hung in the balance, and she'd been punished for trying to save it. Her compassion turned against her in a way that made her stomach churn. She pressed her forehead against the cool wall, forcing herself to breathe, her hands trembling in her lap, her fingers tracing the raw marks on her wrists. She'd called her coworker, Jamal, from the rescue shelter before they took her phone, her voice shaking as she begged him to get to Max before it was too late. "He's at the Whitmore mansion on Peachtree," she'd whispered, her words rushed, her heart pounding. "He's trapped in the fence. Hurry, Jamal. He's dying." But she had no idea if he'd made it, if Max was still alive, the uncertainty gnawing at her like a jagged blade, a pain that cut deeper with every passing minute. She wanted to scream, to demand someone listen, but she knew how this worked, had seen it too many times in her neighborhood, in the stories her mother told, in the news reports that played on loop. She was a black woman in cuffs, and to them, that made her guilty until proven otherwise. Her thoughts spiraled. Max's golden fur, his pleading eyes, the blood on her hands, the way his whimpers had faded to silence. She'd failed him, hadn't she? The weight of that thought crushed her, her breath hitching as she fought back a sob, her nails digging into her palms as she tried to hold herself together. At the Whitmore mansion, Margaret stood in her pristine foyer, her hands shaking as she watched a veterinarian work on Max in the yard, her silk robe clinging to her sweat-dampened skin, her silver hair now loose and wild around her shoulders. Jamal had arrived just in time, his expertise guiding the vet as they carefully freed the dog's leg and head from the fence, their movements precise despite the urgency, their hands steady as they worked to save a life that hung by a thread. Max was alive, barely, his breathing shallow but steady, his leg bandaged, his golden fur matted with blood and dirt, a stark contrast to the pristine lawn around him, the grass still wet with evening dew. The vet, a gruff woman named Dr. Ellis, looked up at Margaret, her expression hard, her gloved hands stained red with Max's blood, her eyes narrowing with a judgment that made Margaret's stomach twist. "This dog would have died if that girl hadn't acted," Dr. Ellis said, her voice clipped, her words a condemnation that hung heavy in the air. "She called for help before your alarm even went off, Mrs. Whitmore. She was trying to save him, not steal him. You got this all wrong." Margaret's face flushed, her pearls suddenly feeling tight around her neck, her fingers twisting the fabric of her robe as if it could shield her from the truth. She stammered, her voice trembling, her pale blue eyes darting away, unable to meet Dr. Ellis's gaze. I thought she was trying to take him," she said, her words faltering, her mind racing to justify her actions. "She climbed my fence. How was I supposed to know? She didn't belong here. She looked suspicious." Jamal, a tall black man with a quiet intensity, stood up, brushing dirt off his jeans, his dark eyes boring into Margaret's with a fire that made her flinch. "You didn't ask," he said, his voice low but cutting, each word a blade that sliced through her excuses. "You saw a black woman and assumed the worst. Aaliyah risked her life for your dog, crawled over a spiked fence, cut her hands to free him, begged for help while you called the cops. And now she's in cuffs because of you, because of what you thought she looked like. That's on you, lady. That's on you." Margaret's hands twisted harder, her eyes dropping to the floor, shame creeping into her chest like a slow poison, a bitter taste she couldn't swallow. She thought of the grainy security feed, the panic that had seized her, the way she described Aaliyah to the 911 operator. Dangerous. Doesn't belong. The words echoed in her mind, a mirror reflecting a truth she didn't want to face. But she couldn't bring herself to admit it. Not yet. Not fully. "I was protecting my property," she muttered, her voice weak, unconvincing even to herself, her gaze dropping to Max, who lay panting at her feet, his bandaged leg a stark reminder of the day's chaos. A living testament to the courage of a woman she'd condemned without a second thought. Outside the precinct, a crowd was growing, their voices rising in a chant that echoed through the humid night, a chorus of defiance that shook the air. "Free Aaliyah! Justice now!" A bystander, a local barista named Keshia, who'd recognized Aaliyah from the shelter where she'd once adopted a cat, had filmed the arrest, her shaky video capturing Harper's rough handling, Aaliyah's desperate pleas, and Margaret's accusations. The officer's sneer, a stark contrast to Aaliyah's tear-streaked face. The footage spread online like wildfire, shared across social media with captions demanding justice, hashtags amplifying the outrage to a deafening roar. Animal rights activists joined forces with racial justice advocates, their signs bobbing in the air as they marched outside the precinct. Aaliyah saved Max. Free her, and no more bias. The story hit local news stations within hours, then national outlets, the headlines stark and unyielding. Black woman arrested while saving dog. Racial bias suspected. Reporters set up cameras across the street, their live feeds capturing the growing crowd, their voices a mix of anger and hope as they called for Aaliyah's release, for accountability, for a city that could do better. Inside, Harper sat at his desk in the precinct's bullpen, scrolling through the video on his phone, his jaw tight, his pale face flushed with a mix of anger and unease, his fingers gripping the device so hard his knuckles whitened. The comments were brutal, a relentless wave of condemnation that crashed over him, calling him a racist, a bully, demanding his badge be stripped, his career ended. His captain had already called, voice icy through the phone. Fix this, Harper, or you're done. This is a PR nightmare, and I'm not going down for your mess. But Harper's mind was a tangle of justification and doubt, a storm he couldn't quiet. He'd followed protocol, hadn't he? She was on private property, a reported thief. Her presence in Peachtree Estates a violation of the unspoken rules he'd internalized over years on the force. Yet the vet's report, confirming Aaliyah's story, gnawed at him like a splinter under his skin, a truth he couldn't ignore. He thought of his own biases, how he'd assumed guilt the moment he saw her, how he'd dismissed her pleas without a second thought, how he'd let Margaret's frantic call shape his actions before he even arrived. Officer Maya Brooks, a black colleague with a no-nonsense demeanor and a reputation for calling out bullshit, approached, her eyes blazing with a quiet fury, her uniform crisp despite the late hour. "You screwed up, Dan," she said, her voice low, her words cutting through the precinct's hum, her hands on her hips as she stared him down. "You saw her skin and made a choice. You didn't listen, didn't ask, just acted. That's on you." Harper's face reddened, his voice defensive, his hands clenching into fists on the desk, his badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. "I was doing my job, Maya," he snapped, his tone sharp, his pale blue eyes flashing with defiance. "She didn't belong there. She was trespassing. I had a report of a theft. What was I supposed to do?" Maya leaned in, her voice a whisper, sharp and unyielding, her eyes locking onto his with a fire that made him flinch. "Your job isn't to assume, Dan," she said, her words a blade that cut through his excuses. "Your job is to protect, to serve, not to judge. You failed her, and you failed that dog. You better hope that video doesn't end your career, because right now it's looking real bad for you." At the Whitmore mansion, Margaret sat in her armchair, the silence oppressive, the ticking of a grandfather clock the only sound in the vast, empty room. Max rested at her feet, his breathing steady now, his bandaged leg a stark reminder of the day's events, his golden fur still matted with blood despite the vet's efforts to clean him. The vet's words echoed in her mind, Jamal's accusation cutting deeper, a wound she couldn't ignore, a bitter taste on her tongue. She turned on the TV, hoping for distraction, but the news was dominated by Aaliyah's story. Protesters outside the precinct, the viral video playing on a loop, the calls for justice ringing out across the city, a chorus she couldn't silence. Margaret's hands shook as she dialed the precinct, her voice trembling, her resolve crumbling under the weight of her guilt. The realization of her mistake a heavy stone in her chest. I need to speak to the officer who arrested that girl," she said, her words barely above a whisper. Her fingers clutching the phone so tightly, her knuckles whitened. At the precinct, Aaliyah sat in the interrogation room, her wrists still cuffed, her dark eyes burning with defiance, her body tense but unbowed, her sneakers scuffing the floor as she shifted, trying to ease the ache in her shoulders. The room was small, the walls a dull gray, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows that made her head throb, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and sweat. Harper entered, his face a mask of forced neutrality, but his hands fidgeted, betraying his unease, his uniform suddenly feeling too tight, his badge a weight on his chest. "We've got video from the security cameras," he said, his voice gruff, his pale blue eyes avoiding hers as he leaned against the table, his hands gripping the edge. "Shows you trying to free the dog. Vet says you saved its life." "Then let me go," Aaliyah said, her voice steady, though her heart pounded, her fingers digging into her palms, the raw marks on her wrists stinging with every movement. "I told you what I was doing. I begged you to listen. You didn't even try. You saw me, a black woman, and decided I was a criminal. That's why I'm here, isn't it?" Harper flinched, her words hitting like a slap, his face reddening as he looked away, his hands tightening on the table, his knuckles whitening. He opened his mouth to respond, to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat, a tangle of excuses he couldn't untangle. Before he could speak, the door opened, and Margaret stepped in, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly, her silk robe replaced by a simple cardigan, her silver hair loose and unkempt, her pale blue eyes darting between Aaliyah and the floor, unable to hold her gaze. I owe you an apology," she said, her voice trembling, her hands shaking as she took a tentative step forward, her words choked with emotion. "I was wrong. I thought you were trying to take Max, but you saved him. I'm so sorry, Miss Jackson. I didn't know. I was scared, and I assumed the worst." Aaliyah's eyes softened, a flicker of compassion breaking through the wall of anger she'd built, but her voice held steady, a quiet strength running through it like a current. Her gaze shifting to Margaret, then back to Harper, her words a challenge and a plea. "I didn't save Max for an apology," she said, her voice firm, her eyes locking onto Margaret's, then Harper's, her resolve unyielding. "I saved him because it was the right thing to do, because I couldn't let him die. Not when I could help him. But you need to understand, you can't judge people by their skin. You almost cost me my freedom and Max his life. You both did. You saw me and you saw a threat, not a person. That's not just a mistake, that's a choice. And it's a choice that hurts people, that breaks lives." Margaret nodded, tears welling in her pale blue eyes, her hands twisting the edge of her cardigan, her voice barely a whisper, choked with emotion. "I know," she said, her words trembling, her shoulders slumping under the weight of her guilt. "I was wrong, terribly wrong. I was scared, but that's no excuse. I'll make this right, I promise. I'll do whatever I can to fix this." Harper's face remained hard, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt, a crack in his armor he couldn't hide, his hands clenching and unclenching on the table, his badge glinting under the harsh lights. He opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, to say something, anything. But the door opened again, and the captain entered, a stern man in his 50s, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable, his voice clipped and authoritative. "Charges are dropped," he said, his gaze shifting to Aaliyah, then to Harper, a warning flashing in his eyes, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're free to go, Miss Jackson. Officer Harper, you're on leave pending investigation. Hand over your badge, now." Aaliyah stood as the cuffs were removed, her wrists raw and red, the skin bruised and tender, her shoulders aching as she rolled them, trying to ease the pain. She met Harper's gaze one last time, her eyes blazing with a quiet defiance, a strength that made him look away, his jaw tight, his hands trembling as he unclipped his badge and slid it across the table to the captain. She walked out of the room, her sneakers echoing on the linoleum, her steps steady despite the exhaustion that weighed her down, and stepped into the precinct lobby to a wave of cheers from the crowd outside, their voices rising like a tide, a chorus of support that wrapped around her like a shield. "Aaliyah, Aaliyah." She pushed through the doors, the humid night air hitting her face, the crowd's chants washing over her, their signs bobbing in the air, their faces a mix of anger and hope. She saw Jamal among them, his tall frame standing out, his dark eyes meeting hers with a nod, a silent reassurance that Max was safe. But her heart was heavy, her mind still on the dog, on the cost of doing what was right in a world that saw her as a threat, her body trembling with the aftershocks of the day's trauma. Harper was suspended, his badge confiscated, his career hanging by a thread, the precinct's walls closing in around him like a cage. He was forced into a training program on racial bias, a requirement he resented but couldn't avoid. his pride a bitter pill he swallowed with every session. The program was grueling, held in a community center basement, the air heavy with the scent of stale coffee and regret, the room filled with civilians and ex-cops, their eyes hard as they shared stories of bias and harm, their voices a chorus of pain and accountability. In one session, Harper broke down, his voice shaking, his pale face streaked with tears, his hands trembling as he spoke, the weight of his actions crashing over him like a wave. "I saw her as a threat," he admitted, his words halting, raw, his pale blue eyes staring at the floor, unable to meet the gaze of the facilitator, a black man with a steady presence. Not a person, just a threat. "I didn't know I was carrying that. I didn't know it was in me." The facilitator, a man named Marcus with graying hair and a voice like gravel, nodded but offered no absolution, his gaze steady, his words firm. "Knowing's the first step," he said, his tone unyielding. "But it doesn't undo the harm you caused, the lives you broke. You've got work to do, hard work, and it starts with facing the truth." Harper left each session a little more broken, his life a tangle of regret and slow, painful growth. His badge a relic of a past he could never reclaim, his career a casualty of his own bias, a lesson he'd learned too late. Margaret, humbled by her mistake, visited Aaliyah at the rescue shelter a week later. Her silver hair pulled back, her hands clutching a check for a sizable donation, her pale blue eyes rimmed with red from sleepless nights. She stood in the shelter's lobby, surrounded by the sounds of barking dogs and the scent of disinfectant. Her voice trembling as she spoke, her hands shaking as she handed over the check, her cardigan a stark contrast to the silk robe she'd once worn like armor. "I can't undo what I did," she said, her eyes meeting Aaliyah's, her voice cracking with emotion, her hands clutching the check as if it could absolve her. "But I want to help. I want to make this right, Miss Jackson. I've been wrong, terribly wrong, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to fix that." Aaliyah took the check, her expression unreadable, her brown eyes searching Margaret's for sincerity, her hands steady despite the ache in her wrists, the bruises still visible under her sleeves. "This isn't about money," she said, her voice steady, her words firm, her gaze unflinching. "It's about understanding. You can't keep seeing people like me as the enemy, as threats who don't belong. Max is alive because I was there, not because of who you thought I was. You need to see that, really see it, if you want to make this right." Margaret nodded, tears welling again, her voice a whisper, choked with emotion, her shoulders slumping under the weight of her guilt. "I know," she said, her words trembling, her hands clutching the edge of her cardigan. "I'm trying. I'll keep trying. I'll do better. I promise." She left the shelter, her steps slow, her heart heavy with the weight of her growth, a journey just beginning, a path she'd walk with Max at her side, his presence a constant reminder of the courage she'd failed to see in Aaliyah. Aaliyah returned to her work at the shelter, her resolve unshaken, her hands steady as she tended to the animals who needed her, her brown eyes bright with a quiet determination. She adopted a rescue dog, a scrappy mutt with a missing ear and a tail that never stopped wagging, naming her Hope, a reminder of the resilience that had carried her through that night, a symbol of the light she'd found in the darkness. The incident sparked community dialogues, bridging divides between races and classes in Peachtree Estates, though the scars of bias remained. A reminder of the work still ahead. Animal rights advocates and racial justice activists collaborated, hosting workshops in church basements and community centers, their voices rising in a call for understanding, for change, their meetings filled with the hum of voices, the clatter of folding chairs, the scent of coffee and determination. A plaque was erected at the shelter, its words carved in bold letters, a testament to the fight for justice. Kindness knows no race, but justice must. Aaliyah's story became a beacon, a testament to courage in the face of injustice, a call for a world where compassion, not bias, prevailed, where a black woman could save a life without losing her own. She walked Hope through the streets of Vine City each evening, the dog's tail wagging, her own steps steady, her heart heavy but unbroken, her brown eyes reflecting the city's lights as they glittered in the distance. The fight wasn't over. Not for her, not for Atlanta, not for the countless others whose stories hadn't yet been told. The names that filled the news, the faces that haunted her dreams. But Aaliyah knew, as she looked at the skyline, the city's heartbeat thrumming beneath her feet, that every act of kindness, every stand against injustice, was a step toward a better world, a world where hope wasn't just a name, but a promise, a future she'd fight for with every breath she had.